for joining us for this evening's program, Driving the Shift, Tax Activism, and the Move to Land Value Tax. I'm Josie Foss, Executive Director of the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation, which was founded in 1925 with the mission to share and advance the ideas of Henry George. George was a 19th century social reformer who's probably best remembered today for his fervent belief that a land value tax is the most effective way to capture resource rents and ensure economic equity for all people. As everyone here probably already knows, a land value tax is essentially a better property tax. It untaxes improvements, leaving only the value of land subject to taxation. It's used to great effect internationally in a number of places. And in the US, it's used in a number of school districts and municipalities, mostly in Pennsylvania, which is why I'm honored and thrilled to be here tonight in the company of some of the leading advocates working to change that by bringing LVT to communities across the US where it's so desperately needed. Tonight's programs will include remarks from each of our presenters, followed by an interactive Q&A that'll be moderated by our research director, Steve Hoskins. Because one of the outcomes we're hoping for in hosting this event is to connect folks interested in LVT to one another, we ask that you start by throwing your location up in the chat so that you can see who's nearby to you and potentially connect with them. Please feel free to enter any questions that you have into Zoom's Q&A function so that Steve will see it when we get to that portion of the program. And the last thing I'm going to mention is that we will be sending out a brief survey after the event. It'll help us craft better events in the future, but really the tool is intended to help us make those connections between all of you who want to enter into that LVT dialogue with one another. So when you do get that survey, please take a minute to complete it. I promise it's not long. So now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Nick Allen is a PhD candidate at MIT and a consultant to the City of Detroit on fiscal policy. Since 2017, Nick has been building a coalition of community advocates, developers, foundations, and businesses that aim to rebuild the city's revenue system on a land value tax. In coordination with Detroit City leadership, Nick has been involved in modeling taxpayer impacts and drafting state legislation to enable a local option land value tax. And he's the co-author of the 2022 Lincoln Institute report, Split Rate Taxation in Detroit, Findings and Recommendations. Nick, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Josie, I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I've got a short presentation to go over what we've been working on in Detroit and excited to talk about where we are. I would just emphasize that, this is work in progress. We are still trying to, figure out exactly what the final form of legislation will be like, what it will mean for the city. But I think it's been a really fruitful process to try and get to the core of the problem. And that's what I want to talk about here today. So if you've read anything in the media about Detroit in the last 10 years or so, you've probably heard one of two stories. One is that Detroit is a city in sort of intractable decline that hasn't really shifted direction since the 1950s, when manufacturing flight set in, when racial segregation sort of dominated the entire region, and that things haven't really changed. In fact, Detroit has mostly sort of continued to lose population and seen capital flight for a long time. The other story that you may have heard is that it's a city resurgent, that there are many stranded assets that were once thought uninvestable that are suddenly investable, that there are people interested in the city for the first time in a long time, and that there is a kind of healthy set of green shoots everywhere in the city. And I think the thing that I would say about that is that both those stories are true. One thing that has really attracted me to this work, I think, is that in the history of the Georgist movement, there's been a lot of work on reconciling those kinds of conditions, thinking about the possibility of economic growth and poverty existing alongside each other, and what are the fundamental drivers of that. So for me, one of the things that I'd like to convince you of is that both of those effects are a natural byproduct of the way that cities tax property, particularly declining cities. And this just shows what that experience has been like in Detroit. So over the last, let's say 80 years or so, Detroit's tax base has largely collapsed in terms of property taxes, and that has forced it to concentrate the tax rates that it charges on a shrinking tax base. So that has meant a significant reduction in services overall, but it's also meant that residents and property owners have paid increasingly high, difficult to bear rates throughout the city in exchange for shrinking services. You may know that, of course, that Detroit went through a bankruptcy in 2014. One of the things that did not occur in that bankruptcy is a significant restructuring of the way that it raises revenue, although it significantly changed the expenditures that it faced as a city. the other thing to say about that, and I think this is why it's so challenging to fix this tax structure in the city, is that Detroit ends up charging one of the highest property tax rates on broad property, land and improvements, and some personal property in the country. And that has really strong regional effects. You can see here that Detroit taxes property Detroit is basically defined by this dark red color. Detroit taxes property at a rate that's about 2 to 3 times its suburban neighbors. And I think one of the effects that is really striking about that is you see when houses disappear in the city, and Detroit has sort of steadily lost housing stock over the years, an equal number of units continues to be built on the periphery of the region. And I think that's quite telling about this. It tells a story about what it means to have different costs of capital, different costs of investment in different parts of the region. So within that system, I think there are 2 big problems. The first is that in an environment where investment is heavily suppressed, land values are very low. It is cheap to amass a huge amount of land and to hold it in whatever use you would like for as long as you want. That, of course, can mean that you can hold land in speculation in areas that you expect to grow in the future, a classic problem that we all think about. But I think this is particularly pernicious in Detroit, where you can hold any vacant residential lot for less than $25. And with taxable value limitations, you can do so almost indefinitely at the same price. The other side of that is that owning invested assets, houses, businesses, warehouses, is very difficult because the tax rates on those properties are so high. It is difficult to make planful investments. It's difficult to absorb the long-term operating costs of, say, putting a new roof on your property. And one of the effects of that is that people have abandoned many properties in the city for a long period of time. But over the last decade or so, there was a wave of tax foreclosures that hit the city that caused about 32% of all residential properties to enter tax foreclosure at least once. And I think, if you want to think about overburdens, that may be the most important part of what we're trying to do in Detroit, is resolve this issue in a more permanent way. The last thing I want to say is I have a lot of hope about the current trajectory of the city. And the real question is how to stabilize and lock in the gains that the city has had recently, while also expanding and thinking about ways to do that in a more equitable way citywide. I think one of the big problems in the city is that the way that investment occurs right now is through a process of tax abatements. So individual treatments of tax relief on individual properties. And I think of that as kind of a pseudo land value tax, because effectively what you're doing is relieving the taxes on new investment and leaving the taxes on existing land in place. I think this is actually a very good intuition about what might be a good way to recover the city. And it works quite well. I used to underwrite these deals in Detroit. The problems are that this is a selective process. There are only certain properties that qualify. It is a ration process. There's only about 40 of these that a city council can do in a given year. And it's a temporary support. So at the end of a tax abatement, typically 10 to 15 years, it comes off, your taxes jump at 80%, and you're really no better off thinking about long-term capital maintenance than you were in year 0. So this is the path we have available for economic recovery in the city. And the question is, how do you multiply that and create a more inclusive economic development environment? And I think that's the set of problems we've really tried to focus on. We've talked about a proposal for a local option, revenue neutral land value tax to do 4 things. The first is to relieve costs for overburdened owners, businesses, and renters, and particularly thinking about longtime residents of the city who have chosen to stay despite these fiscal headwinds. The second part of that is that we want to spur up a more inclusive economic development environment that doesn't rely on these preferential subsidies. The third is to reduce the overall need for those tax abatements. We would like projects to be able to proceed without having to go through a lot of public process. And the fourth is to protect overall the total revenue that the city is taking. We think it is really important for a city that already has a very a thin basis of revenue to protect the revenues it has and to see growth in the long term. So the overall crux of the proposal is much like what Pennsylvania has done, but it thinks a little bit about the constraints of the Michigan Constitution and looks a little different than a classic split rate tax. So the legislation that we've been working on says that we want to let voters in any Michigan community, meaning at local option, create 2 things: a universal tax exemption that would remove certain ad valorem taxes, meaning taxes on all property, from all the properties in the city. So it's a uniform tax reduction on all property that is taxable. And the second part of that is dollar for dollar to replace that revenue lost with a tax on land value. So that the basis of that tax, that value would just be land alone, but the amount collected, the total levy, is identical to the taxes lost. And I think much like a split rate tax, the effects are the same. The goal is to reduce the tax rate on improvements and increase the tax rate on land. The only difference is that we're effectively charging two taxes and not just two rates. So when we thought about how to do this, we've targeted something that's sort of about a rate that's about 3 to 4 times the tax rate on land, or the tax rate on buildings, to be a tax rate on land. And the reason we do that is because we've been thinking about this question of how do you create a competitive price of entry? How do you take that dark red map and turn it into a more kind of equitable region where the fiscal cost of living in different places is more equal? And so in the model that we've been working in, the goal is to lower taxes by about 24 to 25% on all homeowners. A remarkable thing about this is it's a very uniform tax relief for homeowners and for small rental properties throughout the city. 97% see immediate tax relief. We're hopeful that we can sort of bring that to 100% seeing no gain in taxes at all. And I'd say that's really one of the cornerstones of the proposal. This is a resident-centric strategy for bringing tax relief to Detroiters. The other part of this, and I think part of the coalition that we've been building, is thinking about ways that we can talk about this as a much bigger form of the type of limited tax abatements that we do now. So unlike these selective tax abatements and selective poverty exemptions with selective relief, land value tax reform is different in 3 ways. It's universal. It means that all properties are treated by the same rule: a lower tax on improvement, a higher tax on land. It is a permanent reform. There's no cliff at the end of this where somebody drops off and their tax bill jumps by 80%. And it's unconditional. I think one of the biggest problems in a market where you have differential tax treatments is that insiders do better. People who have sophistication about the tax system are able to access favorable tax structures that other people cannot. So this is not a system that asks you to apply land value tax as a universal and unconditional reform. So just to catch you up to speed, we've been working on this for a number of years now. I think I'd say this is an iterative process, but I think there are 5 parts that have been important to us. The first thing we really did is build a coalition of supporters, thinking about people who are invested in the city for the long term and who are interested in the city's long-term recovery. The second part of that is that we've tried to be careful and empirical about what we think those effects actually are, particularly of what it would mean to reduce taxes on residents, but also what are the business growth effects that we would expect. We were able to work with the Lincoln Institute and a team of 12 economists from across the country who looked at some of the city's most salient questions on those matters. The third thing is to look very carefully at what this means for individual properties and to think about all the different existing tax treatments in the city so that we understand how all these differently situated owners are impacted. The fourth is dealing with a lot of existing complexity in the tax system. In addition to trying to change the rates, we're also touching things like tax increment finance districts, existing tax abatements, various partially tax exempt treatments, different jurisdictions. Like to wrap our arms around that whole system and all its complexity now is not an easy part of this process. We think we've done it, but it's taken a long time. And the fifth thing is to draft legislation that thinks about all those differences. What's left to do? Well, to do this in Detroit would require state legislation, just as it would in any other state, because taxing permission is a state level concern in the US. We would need state legislative approval to do so. I'm optimistic that can be done. And the second thing is that within the Michigan rules, you would also need a local vote. And I think that's quite appropriate in this case, because it's a question of how, is this a tax that is broadly wanted by residents of a city that have seen significant economic disinvestment over time? So what have we learned through this process? I'll speak mostly for myself here. I think it's been really helpful to sort of zoom out to the big issues that we're trying to tackle first, and focus on the question of, is a land value tax the appropriate solution second? One thing that's allowed us to do is really think about, at the local level, what actually matters here is the design of what we're replacing with this land value tax. There are a lot of different things you can do. You don't just need to untax improvements. And we also need to consider, at what rate do we want to untax improvements? The third thing that's been challenging and helpful is to really take the constitutional constraints that exist seriously. We assume this has to be done within the existing confines of the Michigan Constitution. I won't get into the details, but that has been the sort of the most important thing about thinking about how we would structure this legally. The fourth is that I think about this primarily as a play for growth and equity in the city. This is a way to drive affordability for residents. It's a way to increase the rate of investment. But we also need to be really realistic about the fact that there are significant distributive effects in the short term, and people have investment-backed expectations about what their current land ownership and property ownership means. So we try and deal with those carefully and deliberately, and frankly, with the people affected by this proposal. And the fifth thing I would say is, as I've leaned into this proposal over time, I've really thought there are lots of different ways to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish. I think of this as like more than one way to see the cat, to use the old George's metaphor here. Michigan, like California, for example, has a taxing limitation that freezes the taxes that you pay in a given year. Removing that, which is effectively an anti-LVT, is in some ways as transformational as implementing a higher tax rate on land, because primarily the people benefiting from that frozen tax rate are people who have seen significant appreciation of their land value. There are lots of other value capture mechanisms that have been discussed, but I would just say, I think you can be creative about the design of the replacement, and also think more broadly about what is the particular set of solutions that that we're trying to address with the capture of land rent. So that's what I have for you. I'm really excited to turn this over to Representative Alex Lee, and I'll let Josie take the floor back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. We've all been watching Detroit very anxiously, and it's wonderful to get your firsthand perspective. Our next presenter is Assemblymember Alex Lee. He represents California's 24th Assembly District. He provides progressive leadership on urban issues and authored AB 309, which would create a California social housing developer, and AB 362, which would require the state to study how a land value tax would compare to the current property tax system. Assemblymember Lee, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I will unfortunately have to be brief. I am running around with a lot of engagements today over here in our state capitol, but I'm pleased to be joining you all today. And I was really fascinated by a report Nick just presented for Detroit, and it shows the great outcomes that we could possibly achieve with our smart revenue measures. That's something I think for a long time, California, unfortunately, has not seen the benefits of, although we have seen the detrimental effects of. I was struck by, obviously, when you look at Detroit's home prices right now, when you're in about $250,000 and the property taxation rate is about $8,700. That is far exceeding the California measures, far out of whack, because something we have since 1978, roughly, called Proposition 13, which basically froze property taxation at 1% of the assessed rate of when it was bought. So that has led to vast, longer story, but vast wealth inequality that exists within California. So there are people currently, even in my district, who are about to sell their home or own their home for $1.6 million, but pay a fraction of a tax burden of a Detroit resident right now. And that has, of course, led to all sorts of different systemic failures and very inequitable revenue measures that exist across California right now. And you see this constantly play out even in national headlines. So right now we are in the midst of some really, really terrible problems, I think, stemming from a lot of these revenue constraints too, where, of course, in California, in my home county of Santa Clara County, where the average home price is in the millions right now, we have a severe, severe housing crisis right now. So while we also have a housing crisis where not enough people have affordable housing options out there, we also are underbuilding. So you think in a normal market, there's just a huge catastrophic demand for a product, and yet no one is building. And it is because of these strange, perverse incentives we have with land use. As many people on here know, LVT land value tax incentivizes more productive and efficient use of land. But in California, you have the most extreme example of speculation that exists. You see all the time on news that happens where, very terrible structures, just basically based because where they are, sell for millions of dollars with the land itself. You have all the incentive in the world because of Prop 13 of property taxes to never improve your structures. So this year, I introduced a bill, if I remember the number, AB 362 this year, that would essentially ask the state of California to officially study the impact if we had a statewide land value taxation system. I'll tell you what happened to the bill in a second, but I think it would have been a very powerful tool if we use our official revenue tax departments to study the real dollars and cents effects. We have a lot of great university partners, nonprofits out there, and a lot of think tanks thinking partners out there that think about what could be happening. And we can also look to examples like in Pennsylvania or in Michigan and how they're doing these things or trying to theoretically do so. I thought it would be very important, especially given our kind of special circumstance because of Prop 13, to really look at the impact, right? I wanted to ask the state of California to show what would the tax burden shift be from a current taxation system in California and move over to LVT system or perhaps different variations of it. Would an individual taxpayer burden go up, go down? What would the revenue measure look like? All that's just analyze it, right? Because we know theoretically speaking, and there's a lot of great evidence suggests that it is a much more efficient taxation system, but I wanted to see the real dollars and cents effect of it. Because especially during a housing crisis as we have in California, it's so important to really use our infill properties the maximum extent possible. Now, unfortunately, that bill to study brought on all the opposition of our very conservative tax groups that really want to preserve the status quo of taxation and a lot of business groups. So even my study bill, unfortunately, did not proceed to get a vote. And for the time being, is stalled, but we still have hope in the next years. But it really showed, I think, more opposition than I was anticipating, given it was a study bill. To my credit, I told people, I'm not proposing that we switch over to it. Perhaps what the state of Michigan will do, propose for the city itself and do it. I think is really amazing if a city wants to go down that road. But I think it's really important to have a state like ours to have the information to show people that this could be a system and what the real implications of it could be, right? And without those metrics, even at the most far extremes of complete pure LVT system and our status quo, I think it's hard to judge for ourselves what the effects could be. And there could be savings across the board, right? There could be, of course, savings on taxpayers. There could be different things that happen. That's why I'm really interested in that report. You talking about revenue neutrality really piqued my interest about the compensation effect of it. So maybe it's something we incorporate later on. But that kind of information is really vital, but it still shows that, as in the previous presentation we talked about, some people are kind of afraid to move away from the status quo, unsure of what lies on the other side. And that's reasonable. And that's why I think it's important to study it, to look at these things. So we're going to still continue in California to look at all our avenues to study and do so. I just thought it would be the most appropriate because we, of course, are control the tax rolls. We collect, we have all the data, and we can also look at it theoretically if we had a different system applied to it. It would be very, very interesting. So that's kind of context of what the bill did. And it is something that, of course, even in California, we do have a Georgia's history. In fact, actually, over 100 years ago, this was attempted several times, didn't quite pass. But even back in the day of Henry George himself and the early turn of the 20th century, land speculation was rampant. It's still the case today. And I'm very excited to see successful, or at least a lot of successful attempts going towards the right direction for other places for California to follow. Because if Detroit is successful and Pennsylvania is successful and other places across the country are successful, we can start modeling after ourselves. And even though California is the 4th largest economy in the world, I like to pride ourselves in that. And a lot of times we have a lot we can do to be humble and learn from other places. So if you're very interested, especially if you're a Californian, please write to your representative, tell them that you support AB 362 and you want it to be heard and you just want to study, get the information out there. But that's the important thing is we are at the precipice, just like maybe 100 years ago, of a nascent movement. Movement perhaps is quite nerdy and quite dorky and quite in the weeds of it. But once it is understood with people, it's quite intuitive. It's hard. There's a first barrier, I would say, to folks, but once you get into it, it's pretty intuitive, I would say. And really hope to have learn more from you all. My staff are going to be on the call too, taking notes and learning more about it. But I am really encouraged by this movement we have in the nation, and even I see internationally. So hopefully we'll be able to move to a more efficient land value taxation system. So thank you again for having me here.
Assemblymember Lee, thank you so much for your remarks and for your advocacy. I know we have long looked at California as a bit of a lost cause because of Prop 13, but I think we're all really heartened by the work that you've been doing, very appreciative. And yeah, it's starting with a study hits very close to our hearts because we do a lot of that in our shop, but just thank you so much for being here tonight and for the good work that you're doing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
So our next presenter is Joe Galbach. Joe is the VP of Government Affairs at the Richmond Association of Realtors, where they advocate on behalf of the 6,000 realtors in their region. In 2020, RAR supported state enabling legislation that allowed the city of Richmond to implement a land value tax, and in 2022 supported a budget amendment to study implementation in the city. Currently, Joe is working with Councilman Andreas Addison, City Hall, and other stakeholders to move the study forward. Joe, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Can't wait to hear more about Richmond.
Well, not to be redundant, but as Josie mentioned, I come from this from a little bit different of a perspective than I think some of the other panelists, coming from the private sector, and from all places from the realtors. I have to say, I was not on the like bleeding edge of the land value tax, but once someone took the time to explain it to me, it made a lot of sense. And coming from an industry where we represent, not only realtors, but their clients, homeowners, home buyers, and as we are really starting to understand in a really acute way, renters too. This is, I'm sure Assemblyman Lee will laugh at this, but our median rent just hit $1,700 a month for a 1-bedroom. And in Richmond, Virginia, that is quite astounding. And it's hard for folks to save for a down payment when they're, paying rent at that level, in addition to student loans and whatever other cost of living expenses that they might have. And so Richmond is a really unique locality and a unique commonwealth. The state of Virginia is what's called the Dillon Rule state. And I don't know how many folks on the call are familiar with the Dillon Rule, but essentially what that means is that localities only have the authority that is expressly granted to them by the state itself. Basically, it's reverse federalism. And so if the state doesn't say that a locality can do it, then you can't do it. We also, in the infinite wisdom of the Commonwealth, wrote our real estate tax into our Constitution. So we don't have, as localities, we don't have flexibility to offer any kind of tax relief that isn't in the Constitution. And so that means that we are restricted to tax relief that is income targeted, disability, ability targeted, veteran status targeted, age targeted, but beyond that, for like long-term residents, we don't have a lot of flexibility. And what that means in Richmond is that we are seeing incredible growth. We're not the fastest growing locality in the state by any means, but we've seen more growth in the last 10 years than we have since the 1920s when we lost our annexation powers. The other thing that's unique about Richmond, Virginia is that we're an independent city. So Virginia has an independent city system. And what this means is that Richmond doesn't sit in any counties. So we're not like Charlotte, we're not like any Nashville, our peer cities that sit within larger county governments. Richmond, Virginia sits right square between Henrico County to the north and Chesterfield County to the south. And it's 62 square miles of landlocked real estate. We can't add any land. So our land is quite literally finite. And as we see massive amounts of growth, most growth we've seen in about 100 years, we're seeing our prices escalate rapidly. And the impact of that is we're seeing our longtime residents be displaced. The average income of a renter in Richmond now is over $100,000. And we're not adding supply fast enough to accommodate that kind of growth. And I think a lot of this is really spurred out of, and this is my speculation, not, I don't have the hard numbers for it, but we're seeing a lot of folks come down from 95 in the DMV area, DC metro region, where, housing costs are quite expensive. And now you can take the Amtrak up to DC and work hybrid style, you can work remote, right? Like all of the technological innovations that we've seen over the last few years has really enabled a lot more geographic movement within, our 200 square mile area. So the LVTs conversation, to bring this all the way back, really started probably about 2019. And I was not on the leading edge. I heard about this when then Senator Jennifer McClellan introduced a bill in the General Assembly to, going back to the Dillon Rule, add Richmond to the list of localities that has now been enabled by the state government to enact a land value tax. And this wouldn't be a pure land value tax. According to the state code, localities who have the ability to do an LVT can bring their improvement millage rate down to a penny per 100, not zero. So it's not a pure LVT. And so Jen McClellan now is in Congress, but when she was in the state Senate, got this bill passed really under the radar. And I think I saw Nicholas Smith on the attendee list. I know he was involved in those conversations when he was in Richmond, Virginia. And Councilman Addison in the first district of the city really took that ball and they ran with it. And so since about 2020, once I found out about it, found out the effects that it would have on really densifying our urban downtown. We have a lot of like streetcar neighborhoods that are single family. If you look at our land use map, I think about 92% of the city of Richmond is zoned for single family use, which is not uncommon, but it is a fairly high percentage. And so what we've been really focused on at the Richmond Association of Realtors is building in density and making sure that we're constructing homes within our within areas that already have road infrastructure, transit infrastructure, water sewer infrastructure, and continuing to densify our urban area. That not quite as dramatic as Detroit, but saw a lot of disinvestment and white flight, particularly during mass resistance and post-mass resistance. And really hollowed out our downtown core. That led to, like most urban areas in the United States, the demolition of a lot of historic properties, left us with a lot of really nice, attractive surface lots that don't lead to engaged street frontage, just urban areas where consumers want to be, right? And walk from, their house to the coffee shop, to school, to whatever life's functions are. And so we've been working with Councilman Addison's office to just really socialize the idea of a land value tax. And there are 9 city councilors. So Andreas isn't running the show, but working with him and socializing that idea among the councilors, socializing the idea among city staff, and just kind of getting people out and to have a conversation, because Richmond really, like I said, doesn't have a lot of flexibility when it comes to tax relief. And so for our single family homeowners who are in kind of some of the old trolley neighborhoods on the outskirts of town, or even areas of town that were annexed from Chesterfield on the south side of the river, it would shift, the burden of that revenue neutral tax burden onto our downtown urban core, and relieve some pressure there. So we, in 2 fiscal years ago, we worked with Andreas to get a line item into the budget to study, much in the same vein as our Assemblyman Lee there, to study an LVT and what that would mean. Because what we don't want to do is we don't want to implement a new policy that is going to have detrimental effects on, exactly the populations that we're trying to provide relief to. And so working with Steve and working with Josie and working with the Schalkenbach Institute, Center for Property Tax Reform, we're moving the ball forward slowly but surely. And one of the cool things that we also have coming down the pike is that we adopted an award-winning master plan 2 years ago. It's called Richmond 300, and it basically, won the Heisman of American Planning Association plans, which is really cool. But now we have to implement it. And the big move, the number one big move in that plan is rewriting our zoning code. So we're not only going to be studying what it means to implement a land value tax, but also what it means to maybe implement the land value tax alongside a zoning code rewrite, or immediately thereafter. So we have a lot of irons in the fire. So for me, from a non-expert point of view and coming from the lobbyist side of things, it's a little overwhelming. But if you don't know the answer, you find the people who do. So I'll leave it there and look forward to hearing some questions.
Joe, thank you so much for that commentary. Obviously, familiar with what's happening in Richmond, and it's a great example of that coalition building that has to happen for something like this to actually be implemented. And this approach of, engaging experts and conducting the studies, I mean, it's exactly how you would want that to roll out. And one of the things that's really striking is just the goodwill on the part of everybody who's involved, in it for the right reasons, which is, I think, kind of the theme that we're hearing across everybody tonight. So let me go ahead and introduce our last presenter, Isaiah Thompson. Isaiah Thompson is a senior policy analyst at the Community Service Society of New York, where he researches and advocates for policies that help secure better lives for low-income New Yorkers and stronger urban communities. Isaiah's work is centered around the preservation of New York City's public housing stock, voucher program reforms, land use, and property tax policy. Prior to CSS, Isaiah worked as an analyst for the New York Housing Conference and for New York City Controller Scott Stringer. He holds a Master's of Public Administration and a certificate in Quantitative Analysis and Evaluation from NYU's Wagner School of Public Service. Isaiah, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thank you. Unlike the rest of the panelists, I think New York City is a bit further behind in the push for land value tax, despite Henry George being a very proud New Yorker, and lots of Georgians actually making pushes for land value tax in the past. But yeah, we are starting from almost square one in some senses. I have a small presentation. I'll share the screen here. Okay. So just share a little bit about our organization and where we're coming in on this. The Community Service Society is this very old organization created in late 1800s. Helped create the precursor to Social Security, the fares in New York City. If you know, it's a subsidy for means-tested subsidy for transit, the subway. We pushed up good cause eviction. Put a lot of the effort behind that from a research standpoint. Also, a lot of the preservation of public housing, and something we have spent a lot of time on over the last few decades. As you may know, New York City is one of the places that has quite a lot of public housing left. That's sort of the work we do, but part of that has also been pushing for progressive taxation. And the conversation in New York has been surrounding mostly the 421A, which is a tax abatement in the city that was first there just for the creation to spur development in general, but then became affordable housing tax abatement. And that has been the big fight in New York City it's been since its inception. And again, this budget session, it became another fight, and the tax abatement has not been reissued, so we now don't have that tax abatement. To add to that, this session we've had big fights about vacant units. Depending on what agency you trust, we have either 40,000 or 80,000 vacant units in the city. So that is another big issue that has some implications when it comes to taxes. And then also, it's a place where we spend millions and millions of dollars on investments that are often captured by speculators. So I think given sort of these battles, I think the CSS saw an opportunity to enter the land value tax into a conversation that hasn't been there for a long time, despite the fact that property tax reform has been on the minds of people in the city for almost, I think de Blasio had a big part of it, and then Bloomberg also gave it a try. But generally, everyone agrees that our tax system is really opaque and really bad. We even have the only thing that's been able to bring together GOP and Democrats. The city has been this small coalition of electeds who wanted to push tax reform. And the last mayoral race, we actually had one candidate who proposed vacancy tax, increasing tax on vacant land. We had a Republican nominee who supported tax reforms, property tax reforms generally, and also it was a major piece of a couple other campaigns as well, one of which I worked for and tried to make that a thing, but did not work. So generally, I think there is an understanding that our tax system is broken, and I'm just gonna talk about a few of the major issues that we see. We know that one, New York City has assessment limits, and these things cap the growth of the assessments over time, despite widely fluctuating market changes. And what's really weird about New York, which it's not like this in the rest of the country, I think there's maybe one other city, our assessment limits don't reset upon the resale of a property. So the example is, you have a property that was built in 1981 and you have one built in 2022, you can, if even with the same value, you've got a more than 50% effective tax rate increase just on the properties that have the same value. So the assessment limits are a real issue that I think everyone has a problem with generally, unless you own one of those undervalued homes. Just further on, effective tax rates for apartments are a lot higher than for those in own homes. Our effective tax rates for the apartments are way higher when you look at other large cities, according to Lincoln Institute's great annual sort of checking out of every single large city's tax policies. It puts us pretty high there. The rate's also determined by a really weird class share system. A lot of times we don't actually figure out what the class share for the tax rates will be. We have 4 classes, depending on the size of the buildings and their usage, but we don't tend to get these rates until mid-year. So you end up having, first bills that are due, and then the Department of Finance is going back and trying to refigure out exactly what your rate is, and just very, very annoying every single year. And they're also capped, as I said earlier, and don't adjust to the market changes. They're capped at 5% of the change in the share. We also have we've had tons of research back since the 70s, and then even more recently, that show that both vertical and horizontally there are inefficiencies, and there's a really unfairness baked into the tax system. One of my favorite examples is just there's this property in Williamsburg. It's a condo worth about 1.2 million, and then you take one in Throgsnext, which is you can get there, maybe it's 20-minute drive right up to Jackie Robinson, worth 780,000, and the difference in the tax bill is just insane. So generally, I think there is some good news, despite how terrible it may look. 2021, the de Blasio administration did commission a property tax reform commission. He was forced to do this by law because of a suit, and he also didn't release the results of this commission until 2 days before he left office, but it was released, so that was good. Some of the recommendations will try to fix a lot of the things that I mentioned, including trying to bring some uniformity for all of the buildings that have less than 10 units, try to fix some of the assessment issues, and removing the caps on assessments. So we have I think we use this commission's report and some of the recommendations as a great starting point, sort of a basis to which we can at least start to think about some of the issues that need to be fixed. But I think there's still some large issues and obstacles to get over. Number one thing, which everyone sort of stated, was that the tax law is couched in our state law. When we have conversations with people about property taxes, you might wonder why, if everyone agrees that the system is unfair, why can't we change it? Why can't we make it simpler? Just state politics when you're in the city are very difficult. You have a lot of homeowners in the homeowner lobby, which can be really strong sometimes, especially because of how sort of segregated New York is from like both a class and race standpoint, and in some areas, the elected officials and the areas where properties are worth more have a lot of pull, and make it very difficult to really enact change at the state level. I think I've found that it's been difficult to sort of get renters really interested in this and trying to make them understand that they have sort of a stake in this fight, and that it does make a difference. And then yeah, I think generally people are afraid to take on something that would require such a large sweeping change, and really it would require big pieces of legislation, probably multiple, to really get it done. So our coming in, we think that, one, we want to create and push more education around, one, just what our tax system looks like. I think a lot of people, because it's so opaque and so difficult, have a hard time. I think elected officials, including, may have a hard time really grasping what the heck the problem is and how they can even begin to try and solve it. And we are, working with RSF to actually start the ball rolling with 2 reports. One sort of just simply stating, and showing how unequal it is and how the inequities actually play out in people's tax bills. And then the second, really introducing the importance, showing people how important land is, and then introducing also land value tax into this conversation. Because it's not, it doesn't seem to be very salient in New York yet, but I think that can change with some really cool graphs and maps and some of the things that Detroit's already done, which look amazing and are so compelling. I think the second part of that is, I think we really need to start, are going to start building a coalition, making the argument to pro-development, both affordable and market rate advocates, making the connection between vacancy, which is, and underuse, which are, it's not as big an issue, obviously, in places that have had population decline, but we do have underutilized properties, in the middle of Manhattan that, a land value tax, or at least trying to do something that moves us into the direction of a split rate tax, makes that land potentially, increases its use value, hopefully. And then also really engaging renters, fair housing community, and sort of like the transit and public investment community that thrives in New York, and trying to make them understand why this is an important issue for them. And then last but not least, we think we can try and at least start with the baby steps on this, because it would be such a huge change. There are some city level changes, like making sure that the class share system is as fair as possible. There's also been a bill that would create a vacant land class in our tax system that would be supremely helpful. And then also just ensuring that some of the small buildings are also assessed similarly, no matter where they are and what they are. And then the long-term goal would be to hopefully bring a coalition behind pushing towards a split rate tax. And then the things we need, always looking for grant opportunities, so that we can, do the organizing that's necessary to sort of get people out there, get the coalition moving. And this has been great to hear everyone else, because lesson learned, especially when it comes to how to talk about it, what sort of arguments work in different rooms. How do you deal with the really strong homeowners lobby, things like that. We'd love to learn and love to, skip the mistakes on that front, because New York politics can be super caustic. And also just any collaboration we are open and ready to do to move this forward. So I think that's it. I'll pass it back to Josie.
Maybe I'll just jump straight in. Thanks, Isaiah.
Okay.
Yeah, that was great. So yeah, for everyone who's listening, I'm Steve Hoskins. I'm Research Director at the Schalkenbach Foundation's Resource Justice. We're sort of the new research initiative of the foundation. And so, yeah, I'm going to just try and get through these questions in the next 10 minutes. I think there are a few that are quite technical relating to kind of Nick's specific proposal. So what I'll do is we've linked the report that he did in the chat. His details will be available with some of the materials that go out after this, and we'll have the video. So some of those can be chased up that way. But I want to jump off what Isaiah was just saying, and this is actually for all of the panelists. This question from Jeff is kind of about who are the main groups that sort of jump in and support this kind of proposal? Who are the big ones that oppose it? And on the positive side, you know, which are the groups that we should be targeting for positive coalition building? And then who are the likely ardent opposing groups to a split rate tax? And you know, are those landowners, are they developers, are they realtors, Joe? And how do we engage with those groups, both in terms of engaging them with the rhetoric of the proposal, but also with policy design to kind of mitigate some of the common concerns that come up. So that's quite open. If anyone has something to say, then please jump in. Otherwise, I'll ask more specifically. Joe, go on.
I mean, since you kind of called on me there, I guess I'll jump in. Yeah, so we from the jump have brought the Home Builders Association of Richmond into the conversation as well. HBAR is made up primarily of single family subdivision developers that operate mostly out in Chesterfield and some of the outlying suburbs. So not within the Richmond city jurisdiction that would implement an LBT. That said, they also have members who do spec development, and that was the primary impedance on bringing them into the conversation, and do, you know, hold land in downtown Richmond. And those conversations, right, like they have a lot of questions about what this would mean for their investments, but they also understand that they don't live in the city of Richmond. While they have investments, they don't vote in the city of Richmond. And so we haven't gotten to the point where we're out doing, you know, general voter education. I've certainly had conversations with my realtor members, you know, those who understand, you know, the intersection of policymaking and what that means for their business. And once I start to unwind kind of what an LVT means for their clients, or even, you know, for those who do live in the city of Richmond, it makes sense to them. So the pushback that we have gotten thus far, and to be honest, we haven't really socialized it publicly, like in the broader public narrative yet. So I'm not sure what that'll look like, but at least from the developer's perspective, they're not thrilled about it, but they also understand that they may be outmatched if voters do understand what the actual fiscal calculus is for them. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, interesting. So it's kind of just about really emphasizing that there are a majority of homeowners who stand to benefit from this proposal.
Yeah.
And I think, Nick, that seems to have been a lot of what you've been focusing on in Detroit as well.
Yeah, I would say that's an essential basis of the support. But I would also say that there are no members of a coalition for decline in the city. And what I have found in general is that it's not just people whose tax bills immediately go down that are part of the coalition. It's people who sort of understand this long-term problem of tax base erosion, rising rates, high rising costs of capital, and the destruction of value in the city. And, you know, so I tend to actually, I try to pitch the broadest tent possible in thinking about this. I think a nice thing about the split rate tax structure, where a land value tax is paired with a reduced tax on investment, it means that many people who are paying a higher rate of tax on a land portfolio are also getting a lot of unlocked investment value. And that's something that I can walk into a lot of different rooms and talk about very earnestly, and talk about like where is that break even point in terms of where the, you know, in terms of what this will mean for the future uses of your property.
Yeah, interesting. And Isaiah, I think you were sort of emphasizing that you're focusing on the positive side of the coalition, which are the pro-housing folks, the transit folks, the affordable housing folks. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think in the past, when we've had any movement on tax reform outside of even just LVT, it's always been very bureaucratic. The bureaucracy has been very in favor of it, and it hasn't really left outside of that and maybe like academia. And I think that's been, at least in New York, probably a big issue on that. I think definitely that coalition of the renters, and we also have a mess of abatements that would need to be figured out with whatever tax plan. I think that making sure that, you know, homeowners, especially low-income homeowners, and parts of Brooklyn, and parts of Queens, if we can ensure that their tax bills don't go up, I think it's a possibly winning coalition. Without that, it's probably almost impossible because it requires a state level change.
Yeah, okay. And so to jump off that and sort of what a couple of the questions say, maybe Jonathan's one and David's one, I think a common intuitive concern that people have is, what about the progressivity? What about people who are going to be hit by big new tax bills? What about people whose properties are going to suddenly lose a bunch of value, in the process of this shift? So yeah, for all of the panelists again, what are your sort of thoughts about the best way to deal with those concerns? Is it homestead exemptions? Is it making people whole if they've lost property value from this shift? Is it a slow transition? What are some of the strategic elements of dealing with concerns about sudden shocks to tax bills?
I can take a stab at that because we've thought a lot about what this would look like. I can say phase-ins are really important. I know that's been a major part of Pennsylvania's work in split rate taxation, that most cities have done some kind of gradual phase-in of the rate over many years. Second part of that, I think, is essentially thinking about where the incidence of this is overall, and adjusting the rates that you're proposing relative to where you think that what you think the market can bear. So it is, I noticed Lars Doucette is now on this call, and one point Lars makes very well is that it is actually possible to overtax land. It is possible to tax it beyond its maximum rental value, and we don't want to be anywhere close to that. So one thing that we thought a lot about is, we want to make sure this land value tax is able to offset improvement taxes, but does not go anywhere close to depleting, fully depleting or causing people to abandon properties in the city.
Joe or Jose, anything to say on that one?
I think Nick's argument about phasing is well taken, where it's something that we've discussed doing locally. I don't think we're quite, rubber meets the road there yet. But what I would say is, we can't do things like homestead exemptions. Again, back to being a Dillon rural state, we really don't have a lot of flexibility to add padding as it is. So we would have to be very diligent about the way we phase in something like this. And understanding that, when the results of that study come back, we are looking at populations that have historically been marginalized, pushed to the edge, disinvested in, and in Richmond, Virginia, we have we're very familiar with that, and making sure that we're not continuing to commit and recommit past wrongs.
Yeah, I think ditto with the phase in, probably at least something like 5 years to phase in. And then I think the orthodoxy states that there's going to be no change of property taxes without a homestead exemption, without maybe a circuit breaker as well. But how that's constructed, probably will depend on how the tax plays out.
Yeah, I think a bit about sort of, you should have the tax be done efficiently and then find ways to rechannel that revenue to sort of compensate people or maintain progressivity and the overall system. So yeah, okay. And then, we are really running short on time. So just one kind of collection of a couple of other questions is about land values and assessments, and the sort of attitude of assessors. So often alongside these kind of implementations, there's a need to, update a lot of land valuations across the city. I think someone asked about how the assessors respond to that proposal, which Joe, I know we've had that in Richmond, and Nick, it's the same in Detroit. So yeah, I guess comments on, is there sticker shock from sudden changes to land values that happens alongside this? How do the assessors feel about this, and how do we deal with those
Yeah, I think we have
possible?
very strong agreement in Detroit that updating the land values and making sure that they are well established prior to implementing this is very important. And that people have trust in the validity of those values over the long term. And I think making sure that they continue to adjust for market rate over after the reform is implemented is also important. I think the one thing that I'll say for this is that, especially in a city that's very distressed, the only thing harder than valuing land is valuing broad property where different homes that look facially similar are actually quite different. Some can be gutted, some have tax liens on them. There are a lot of invisible differences between properties that make them essentially impossible to assess as you would in, say, a simple like subdivision development in suburban Michigan. So what I think is going on here is we're actually trying to make the assessor's job easier by taking a input to production that has an explicable value to similar inputs of production just next door.
Yeah, so hearing Nick, you talk about, properties that facially look the same, but could be assessed at very different prices. That makes me feel a little bit better about our situation. We have been in close conversation with the assessor's office in Richmond. Again, we're still in like a socialization phase. Like, he knew generally what an LVT was, but we kind of had to, walk him through it a little bit, do a little bit of hand holding. And, I originally grew up in New England. So one of the things that I learned quickly when I came down to Richmond was, the South has a way of like doing things the same over and over and over and over again in perpetuity. There can sometimes be a real skepticism to any kind of like large scale change. And I don't think that's necessarily unique, but it is, the Virginia way. And so there's just kind of like a real skepticism about anything that is going to really rock the boat. And so just kind of taking the time to have a real conversation and walk through a program and understand that, hey, we're not looking to pull the trigger on this tomorrow, but would you work with us, from the jump to make sure that, we're not going to be having sticker shock, we're going to phase in, we're going to incorporate the zoning code rewrite, that we're going to do all these things, and that, he's involved from the beginning. We want to make sure that, we provide that opportunity. So we're getting there.
I think it's just our Department of Finance is pretty darn good at running its mass assessment. I think the one hiccup we do have is that certain types of properties have to use an assessment calculation that's done at the state level by this other body. That's got to change. But other than that, I think we're not. That probably isn't a big worry in New York City.
Okay, I'll just say I had been thinking about a 9 p.m. Eastern finish, but actually, sorry, 8:30 p.m. finish, but that was actually Assemblymember Lee that really had to jump out, and he ended up leaving early. So for folks in the audience who need to leave, I'll thank you for your time and just invite you to do the questionnaire that we send through in the next couple of days to really let us know what future events you're interested in. But we will carry on for up to another half an hour since there's plenty more questions to go through. So I'll take a breath and panic a little less. So there's been a couple of questions then about a pretty technical question, which I think is mostly for Nick. Your report on split rate, I think, emphasized that actually the effects of trimming back taxes on improvements could actually boost property values more than increasing the rate on land values could. And so for some homeowners who might think, oh, this is going to tank my land value. Well, actually, you get the benefits of greater rewards to developing your land. So I think the question there is both, can you talk a little bit about the dynamics of that and where in the city that tends to be the case? And then, how do we sort of deal with that, when we talk about land taxes bringing down the cost of housing, if it's actually going to raise the value of a lot of sites?
Yeah, awesome question. Let me give like a narrow technical answer and then kind of expand from there. So in the study that we did, we actually looked at Pennsylvania cities' experience with residential assessment appreciations over time, like what happened in the years after a split rate tax relative to places that didn't have a split rate tax. And what we found was, I think, a roughly a 10% growth in residential assessed values in split rate communities. So a couple of things to say about that. First of all, it's not my paper. It was Yang Zhao and Zach Howley who put it together, and they did a phenomenal job, I think, of trying to model that out with the data limitations of looking back to the 1970s. The crux of that paper is really that it's difficult to separate two effects. One is that residential appreciation includes new residential property, and it also includes capitalization of that tax value, right? So that would be an increase in the value of property. So we can't actually pull those two things apart. We don't know what that 10% represents in terms of those two features. I guess the other thing I would say, though, is thinking especially about the distressed market that I'm working in. Affordability really means being able to access financing, access capital for repairs. And fundamentally, what we are doing with the land value tax is reducing the cost of capital. I cannot speak how in more imperative terms about how important that is for a city to allow people to access, say, mortgage financing, especially people who are currently locked out of the market and have been since the Great Recession with the tightening of mortgage credit there. I mean, that is such a deep source of inequity in this country. It is a source of structural poverty. It is a fundamental cause of racial differences with respect to access to financing. And we're trying to address that head on. So in this case, what affordability means is reducing this tax take on investment so that investment can happen and people can make decisions that are sensible for their own lives.
Yeah, really interesting. Thanks for that. It's some complex dynamics at play there. And so I guess that the sort of second half of that question is then, how does this reconcile with the bringing down the cost of housing? And maybe, well, for Nick, but also Joe, I think of the prompting for a lot of the interest in land tax in Richmond is because there's been this influx in demand, right? And the housing market needs to respond to that by building for people, in a hurry. So maybe could you speak to the implications that this kind of shift might have for Richmond's ability to respond to such dynamic, demand?
Sure. Yeah. So we kind of poke fun at City Council sometimes for adopting these resolutions that basically say water's wet. They most recently declared, I mean, I'm grinning, but it's not funny, a housing crisis in Richmond. And, those of us who work in housing have known we're in a housing crisis for a long time now and have been screaming about the lack of supply. But to have City Council pass a resolution that, affirms that has been a really useful tool to point to and say, hey, look, like, we're not the ones yelling this anymore, you are. And I was just looking at the New York Times graphics, I think, that were featured in their email this morning about folks moving from larger, more expensive metro areas to smaller, more affordable metro areas. And Richmond has really been a beneficiary of that, especially because we're so close to DC, Virginia Beach metro area, and the triangle down in North Carolina. And so what that means is, we have a zoning code that was adopted in 1976 and hasn't been, majorly overhauled since. And that has led us to, underproduce our supply, just like almost every other major metro area in the country. At the same time, we're adding population of both, folks with college degrees and folks without college degrees. And we need housing at 60% AMI. We need housing at 30% AMI. We need housing at 100% AMI, right? And I mentioned earlier that our, median renter makes over $100,000, but we're not adding any more rental housing at significant numbers to absorb that. And so what that means is we're having folks be displaced. The folks who are in, rentals that are going for 800, if you can find 800 and $1,000, because somebody can go and pay $1,500 for that same unit and the landlord's going to take it. So we just need supply. And so our hope with LVT is that the same time that we rewrite our zoning code is and make significant updates to the density that we're allowed to put in, that LVT is complementary to that and encourages folks in the more dense areas of town, already existing dense area of town that have underutilized properties, to put in a duplex, put in some gentle density, put in some missing middle. And actually, Steve and I were talking about a property on Chamberlain Avenue that's currently a single family home. And it's in a multifamily zone now. And our future land use map says that that's going to become quarter mixed use. So quarter mixed use for us is right, like, is exactly that, right? Like retail on the bottom, set really close to the street frontage, and then has residential on the top. But this is a single family home right now that is taking up, I think they're on like almost a third of an acre lot. So LVT, would encourage that new homeowner or new property owner who just bought that house in January to, put in a quad, and add some units there, some gentle density. But I'll leave it there.
Yeah, very nice. Okay, so Tyler has added a question that I think is really interesting, sort of in terms of managing the transition. So Isaiah, I'm mostly going to ask you this, and then invite the other two to chip in as well. The transition to land tax sometimes gets or sort of land tax sometimes gets called, I think, the gentrification special, because by kind of aggressively encouraging land to be redeveloped, to respond to whatever market rents are doing there. This can mean that neighborhoods that are, low income, maybe lots of people of color, maybe lots of renters, and facing, rising demand can kind of really rapidly increase the rates of development there, supercharging kind of gentrification and displacement, at least in the short term, even though in the long term that supply might be useful. So I'm interested in your thoughts about that effect, what that might sort of look like in terms of New York, and which is quite sort of ethnically segregated city, and then some of the responses that we might need to take to that as land tax advocates.
Yeah, and I don't think any of us think that, despite the memes, that land tax can literally solve everything. But there are renter protections. I think New York City probably has the largest stock of rent stabilized units probably in the whole country, and that as well as the inclusion of maybe things like Good Cause and others. As well as, we've been trying to push for now 3 years now a new rental subsidy at the state level, which would be amazing, as a try to stop displacement, as a tool to stop displacement, but also just to deal with homelessness issue. But as far as the land tax, I think we also have to think about underutilized lots, still vacant lots in Manhattan, which is insane. Surface parking, tons of underutilized and really undervalued properties that are close to the city center that would spur development. And then also think about the fact that we would then be able to capture a lot of the investment that we do make in the city. And as of course you can always try, and we should use that investment to create more units, which is what we are fighting for at the end of the day. And I think that's something that people who are afraid of gentrification can definitely get behind, in its totality, sort of.
And I wonder if, alongside the sort of suite of renter protections that you've mentioned, right of return, I think, is probably a pretty essential component of that, right? So that if we're going to respond to this demand by redeveloping rapidly, let's make sure that people who were there have a place in the new building, kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. There's the good cause eviction, which is sort of grown, and also there's a lot of push for what DC has in the TOPA, which sort of allow tenants to get together and if their building is being sold, to get a right of first refusal on that. It was a long way coming, but I mean there are so many tools. Should not poo-poo progression in the name of
yeah, I think that's right.
Not using every tool we have.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned as well is just instead of helping the disadvantaged by locking the city in amber, let's just directly help them and give money to renters or whatever we need to. Yeah, Joe and Nick, did you have any comment on that question?
No, I was nodding along. Yeah, no, I was nodding along. Right, we have several historically Black neighborhoods that are, in very dense urban areas of Richmond, including Jackson Ward, Carver, Churchill, Union Hill. And I think, right, like to your point about, not locking a city in amber, right, it goes back to the displacement conversation is, right, like we can't stop cultural gentrification, but what we can stop is financial gentrification, right, displacement. And the land value tax, if we're keeping things revenue neutral, it's my hope that the study will show that, this will help prevent the displacement due to rising property values in some of those neighborhoods. Now, again, I don't have a crystal ball, but hopefully I'll have a study soon. And we'll see what comes out of that. And like I said, like we're not looking to move an LVT forward if that's what the washout is going to be. It's at what cost, right? It's not it.
I'll just add and say, I think this is a common confusion I get in talking about this with audiences, that a land value tax doesn't induce development, right? Removing economically harmful taxes that are exchanged for the land value tax is what reshapes the market overall. And so you can certainly fund a tax reduction that stimulates investment, but you can also use it for any of the other sources that we're describing. You can use it directly as a tenant subsidy. The goal here is just that it is a fungible source of revenue that where it's, and an opportunity to really rethink like what is the relationship between the return of social value and its use within a democratic, like a local democratic system.
Yeah, and I'm
also going to add this that just generally, I mean, right now in the city, at least for New York City, rental properties are paying unfair part of the tax levy compared to the mansions in Queens and parts of Staten Island. And so I mean, the opposite of that is certainly not gentrification, I guess.
I think the question I want to test is the folks that kind of pop up going, oh no, land tax will be difficult for old widows and poor tenants and people of color in their neighborhoods. I want to see how much of their support maintains when we say, okay, well, we'll do a larger land tax and we'll give money to those people, because I'm skeptical that it will. Okay, so Nick, Tom asked about more details about the universal building exemption. So I was going to ask you to just kind of explain that a little bit more and maybe go through the example that you provided. But the broader question that will come out of it to Joe and Isaiah is sort of about the rhetorical framing of a land tax, which is that, when you mention tax, most people just immediately, go to sleep and certainly don't turn up to webinars like this. So I'm interested in whether there are ways that we can frame this or ways that you've had success in framing this that kind of get people's attention, such as the universal building exemption. And we'll start with Nick. But you're still muted for us.
Let me pull up that slide as I'm unmuting myself too. Hopefully you're seeing it and not my desktop.
We've got the presenter view. I think if you tab to the, anyway, it's we can see enough of it that it's probably
okay.
Fine.
We'll go with that for now. The crux of this idea is actually very similar in effect to the split rate tax in Pennsylvania, which is really the inspiration for all of this work. And I credit the Center for the Study of Economics and other people for all the work they've done over the years on explaining that in general. The difference is that Michigan has a flavor of uniformity in its constitution, which is the rule that says ad valorem property must be taxed by the same rate. That is much stricter than Pennsylvania. It says that it's not just a uniform rule, it really has to be strict uniformity in all types of property. So the way that we've thought about coping with that limitation is to create a new tax that is not subject to this ad valorem uniformity requirement, that is a separate land value tax, and then simply exempting a fraction of the ad valorem tax. It's fundamentally it's the same, although we are effectively removing a tax on both buildings and land and exchanging it for a tax on land alone. So that's, I in terms of the narrative around that, I think it's really helpful to frame this as, in the context that I'm working in, to frame this as a play for tax relief. And this actually sort of makes that distinction very clear, that we are providing tax relief to every single property owner in some respect. And in exchange, we're just asking to be able to charge a non-distortionate tax that can deliver that tax relief. Although I hesitate to use the word non-distortionate in a public audience. So.
Yeah, okay. And then the sort of the broader question is about, success of framing this when you talk with, policymakers, industry representatives, and so on. How much success have you folks had with the land tax framing, the building exemption framing, maybe other approaches about kind of doing abatements to improvements, until that effectively becomes a land tax? What are some of your thoughts about the rhetoric, I guess?
Yeah, I guess the way I've always thought about it is that so first of all, the most important thing is what we're trying to accomplish with the ability to tax land. And so I sort of start with the inverse. And for me, framing up these issues around allowing an investment for stability and investment are the most important things that Detroit can be doing to lock in the gains that it's had over the last 10 years. That starts with trying to put it on a level playing field with everywhere else. And so I think different audiences think about this differently, but I think what everybody agrees is that cities like Detroit have been at a long-term disadvantage. And what we are trying to do is remove that disadvantage by allowing for a different form of taxation to exist. And frankly, not just in Detroit, but hopefully other Michigan communities too. It's not that we're trying to create a unique advantage for Detroit, just to remove this disadvantage that has existed for so long.
The other two have any comments on that question? Joe, I mean, I'd be interested in your perspective because you're working with industry people,
Yeah. So, as far as socializing the issue with policymakers, what seems to gain some traction in Richmond is, the old argument of private property rights, and making the case for not punishing people for making improvements to their property, and encouraging those who are underutilizing their properties to capitalize on their investment. And so using some of that framing is helpful, especially, as I am the realtor rep, emphasizing, this is not something we want. We don't want to continue to execute a punitive tax. We're still in the early phases of our conversations with those in the development community, right? Like, I get realtors sometimes get lumped in with developers, but we're really not out there, penciling out deals and figuring out how to make an investment work on a mass scale, like some of our developer partners are. So I think we're trying to tailor our argument and really have a good foundation of what the facts are, what an implementation could look like in Richmond, in addition to a zoning code rewrite, before we start to push the ball up that hill.
I just think we're really early also in trying to increase the salience of land value tax in general, but I do think sort of maybe in an Olinskian way, which sort of like, I think the arguments of sort of cornering the bad guys may be very helpful in New York City. No one likes speculation, sort of a general boogeyman in New York City. So, I mean, one, making sure people can understand how land valuation actually works and the basic difference between the value of the property versus the value of the land. I like the examples where you see two very similar properties and one in middle Manhattan, one in somewhere out in Brooklyn, and just realizing that the difference in those values isn't the building, but in fact the land. So I think once people understand that, I think it makes pushing this easier. And I think also just because we have so much investment in things like, one analysis I think might help is we have the subway improvement on Second Ave in Manhattan and in Harlem, and just seeing how there's such a great increase in property values just because of that improvement. I think people can sort of understand that and understand that we are not, sort of capturing those improvements, and that speculators are instead, just for the just because they happen to, play Monopoly right. So.
Yeah, I think Jeff was asking in the Q&A about what messages get the renters educated and excited about the nexus between property taxes and stagnation and speculation, and so Isaiah, it sounds like what you're talking about there is what really works with those tenants groups that you work with the most. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think we'll see.
Yeah, those early days. Yeah. Okay, nice. I got to apologize to Adam, Edward, and David, as I just haven't, while I'm listening and reading your questions, I haven't quite internalized them. So I can't pose them to the panel just yet. Isaiah, I know that you talk quite a lot about the sunsetting of 421A and that possibly being a good point in time to start talking about this as an alternative and more sustainable solution. Could you speak about 421A, what it is, what the conversations about it are like in New York at the moment, and what role kind of a land tax or a land tax shift could play in that space?
Yeah, it's definitely the most, it gets people either really angry or really happy when you start talking about it, for obvious reasons. But it began as just an abatement for just building in general, for any residential building, new construction. It's like a 30-year abatement on that, and then it became affordability. So there are certain levels of affordability that you have to get a rent agreement, and lower the rents for a certain amount of time, and it's a hot touching point for many progressives because they see it sort of as a waste of tax dollars, even though it's an abatement and doesn't actually is not a revenue raiser. So it's sort of like, it's not technically true. But then you also hear a lot of the other arguments on the other side of that. We wouldn't have any construction without 421A, which it's very hard to prove and hasn't been done yet. So it's but I think there are real worries about slowdowns in production. I think what we know to be true is that without 421A, you don't have affordable development in some of the hottest markets, like in Brooklyn along the East River, and there isn't damn near any affordable development in Manhattan, but what you have there definitely is 421A when it's there. So it's really a big worry, but at the same time, we're sort of in a space where it's gone, and and I think developers are hoping that everything in New York City falls apart, and then we're like, oh man, we need that thing back. But we shall see. And I think in this waiting period, I think it may be a really good time to talk about, there may be another way to sort of maybe spur some better use of a lot of properties that we have left. We obviously don't have many properties left to develop on in the Middle Manhattan, hot parts of Brooklyn. But there is a conversation growing about, and including there is also a zoning amendment moving through the city right now to sort of open up a lot of the further up parts of Brooklyn, Queens, and so there may be tons of opportunities to build there. And then using this point using just the fact that 421A is a tax abatement as a way into the conversation about tax reform, I think it leaves a good opportunity.
there's anything George is so good at, it's finding any opportunity to bring up land tax. So that'll work. Great. Well, I see that, we're drawing close to 9 Eastern and people are starting to have to leave. So I'll wrap up the Q&A there. Apologies to the folks whose questions I wasn't smart enough to understand and reframe to the guests, but to the panelists, but feel free to, use the channels afterwards to engage with us or them on those. And thanks very much to the panelists for the lively discussion. So Josie, back to you.
Yeah, just real briefly, thank you all so much for being part of this event. Thank you to all the attendees. This was great conversation. We are going to be sending out that survey. If you would like to be connected to other folks who are interested in LVT, please do complete that. And this is wonderful. I feel like these ideas are really in a moment of gaining traction and having people like yourselves pushing the envelope forward. It's going to get done. I just know it is. So we're all waiting with bated breath to see how these things play out in the real world. And we know that it's going to end up to be, for the benefit of residents and the folks who are going to need this type of support. So thank you all. Have a wonderful night, and we'll see you later.